Welcome, Rachel Garza. It's so great to finally see you again. I think I was suggesting earlier that when we last saw you, it was pre-COVID, and so it's been a couple of years. So for our audience members, tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to be involved in space.
Yes, so thank you for having me. It's great to see you both as well. And I think you're right. It was pre-COVID. Um, so I'm happy to chat with you again. Uh, my name's Rachel Garza. I am currently a flight test engineering manager at Sikorsky, which is a Lockheed Martin company in West Palm Beach. My story goes back to the beginning, as many people's stories do. Growing up, I grew up in Michigan. I was very interested in aircraft. So that was my very specific interest. I used to have little flashcards with the different aircraft on them, and I would study the facts and just on my own time. It's what I enjoyed doing. I was also very into music. So I had kind of two parallel paths when I was in school. And when it came time to decide on the path, to take into career, I went with the math science path. I really liked physics. And I remember sitting down with my dad, and he asked, what do you see yourself doing? What do you like to do? That was a big thing, what you like to do, and what can be a career for you. So I went the STEM path, although I don't believe we referred to it as STEM back in the olden days when I did it. Yes, I had originally wanted to be a helicopter pilot in the Army, but when I talked with the recruiter, it turns out I was too short, so that wasn't going to pan out for me. So I went the engineering route. At that time, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University was a very good aerospace school, and it was also 1,200 miles away from my home, which was a downside for me. I was a homebody. I enjoyed being with my family, but I decided to kind of take a leap and go to Embry-Riddle, where I studied aerospace engineering. While I was there, I had the traditional college experience. I, took all the good engineering courses, took a few of the additional courses they had, though it's an aerospace school, so they don't have a lot. I think they have more now. And then when it came time to graduate, I didn't necessarily have a job lined up right away. I had met with some Sikorsky recruiters at a career fair and decided that's where I wanted to work. I wanted to do flight tests for propulsion in West Palm Beach, Florida. And so I applied there and did not hear anything back. So I kind of broadly applied elsewhere. And after a few months, I got a call back from some folks at the Johnson Space Center to go work training astronauts. And so it was, a job offer. It was not necessarily in the area I wanted to be, but it sounded very cool. So I moved out to Texas and started my career in space. So that's how I got into it, a little bit accidentally, but it was a happy accident.
No, it sounds like it's fascinating to think, like, first of all, I remember being, I'm trying to remember what I myself was fascinated with as a child. And it certainly wasn't helicopters. My daughter, I think it was dinosaurs, right? But for you to be, I did remember studying snakes. I know that sounds weird, but I had a book, kind of like that's what it reminded me of where I was going with this. I had a book about dogs and all the dog breeds with a stamp collection and snakes. So this book, I just spent the whole summer and I could tell you every fact about snakes and dogs. And yet, of course, no, that did not turn into a career field for me. I love how you started with that. I can't be a helicopter flight person, but I'm going to find something in there. That's pretty fascinating.
Quick question. When I was a kid, I'm much older than you are, but when I was a kid, we built model airplanes. We built models from our favorite, whatever we loved the most. And did you build either model airplanes or helicopters, or did you fly RC aircraft? Did you do either of those?
So I built one model aircraft. It was a very special thing. I did not grow up with a whole lot of money. And so what I would build is, stuff with materials that we had in the house. I distinctly remember my first engineering project was a pair of nunchucks, because I wanted some nunchucks. And I took an old broom that my mom was not using anymore, and cut it, and I had some rope, and I made myself some sweet nunchucks out of that broom. So those were the projects that I did, with things that I could find around the house and turn into something I thought was cool.
That's the best.
So you were like Junior MacGyver.
We'll go with that. Yes.
That's very cool.
She might be too young to know that.
Yeah.
I know who MacGyver is.
Okay.
I know.
Like,
most engineers.
Give me a toothpick and a rubber band, and I'm good.
like our kids nowadays are like, oh,
So,
forget how old we are.
So for our listeners, we had the privilege. Rachel spoke one time at lunch to a group of students. So I know how just tremendous it is. Perhaps you could share a little bit with our listeners about what's it like in the day in the life of a test engineer, a flight test engineer, so that they could get an idea. Maybe that's a path they want to go down to. You specifically said propulsion, right? Propulsion flight test engineer. Tell us a little bit about what it's like in your work at Sikorsky.
So the great thing about the life as a flight test engineer, at least I think it's a great thing, is that it is never a dull moment. We do not do the same thing every day. And you can go in to work and get a little bit of, unexpected happen during your day. Usually it's good unexpected. So essentially, flight test engineers come in near the end of a program when you want to, qualify an aircraft. It's been designed, it's been built, it's been possibly redesigned and rebuilt, and then it comes to test, where we have to, validate the requirements to get it fully qualified to go out to whatever customer it is we're, delivering it to. So we're at the end. So we've already blown past many schedules and budgets by the time we get to flight test. So essentially, we take our requirements and we plan a test to show that the helicopter, in this case, can meet those requirements. So within propulsion, we're in charge of all of the engine integration on the aircraft. So we take these requirements, turn it into a plan, and then we take that plan and make it more detailed, turn it into maneuver by maneuver, what we need the pilots to execute during the test in order to satisfy these requirements. So that's the planning and preparation phase. And then we get to test execution, where we will monitor the aircraft from a telemetry station on the ground. Usually, sometimes it's in the back of the aircraft if we're offsite and we don't have a ground station. So we monitor data from the aircraft in real time to make sure things are going as planned, to make sure we're getting the data we need, and to make sure we don't have to do any, repeat testing, and ultimately to make sure that everything is happening safely, or as safely as possible when you're executing a flight test program.
Right. So, now you make the plan. Let's talk about the criteria for success, right? Is it at your level, or would you say maybe a manager or someone higher up in Sikorsky? Do they determine what is sort of the go, no go, or if a test is successful? Who determines when you're doing it well versus we've got more work to do?
That's another great part about being a flight test engineer, specifically at Sikorsky, is we are very familiar with the data, with the aircraft. And in addition to planning and executing the test, we do the data analysis. So we're familiar with what needs to be accomplished in order to, call it a success. So I would say it's a combination of folks in that chain, depending on how things are going. But ultimately, those who own the data, the flight test engineers, and are most familiar with the data, are the ones who say, thumbs up, thumbs down. We need a repeat. We don't need a repeat. Or, hey, we don't think we're compliant to this requirement.
I think I remember when we were visiting, being in a room, and the kids were all sitting at these kind of computer modules. So they're basically sims that you're running that would kind of see whether or not the parts would work. Is that correct? Was it kind of like,
It's
so
not a
that was it?
simulation. It's
It's
not a
real time.
simulation. It's a
It's
console.
real
Time.
time, real time. I feel
Yep.
like with the kids, when they were there, were they watching a real time one that was that was
They
something
were
where-
watching a simulation. So there was a
Wow.
playback of an early test. So they could, see the data as it was happening.
Got it.
But it looks the same when it's in real time, right? We're pumping
right.
the data down to the room, we're monitoring, we're communicating with the pilots in the aircraft just to make sure everything's going well.
Yeah, and I think I remember there were so many, like there were different roles in the room where people were collecting certain kinds of data and looking at certain things. But I would imagine, so like that's what you mean when you're saying that they're looking at all that data that's coming in real time before they decide. Then they'll go and actually they're testing it as it's going. They're seeing it come in. So whether it needs to be done again. How many times does let's say do they have to do? Well, what's the average time to redo, or does it get done automatically, or does it like 2 or 3? What is the average time for retests?
It actually does not happen often because experimental test pilots are incredibly qualified pilots for conducting these, and they are the experts on the aircraft. They're the experts on how to fly the aircraft. They have a lot of input into the planning process. So very rarely do we need to repeat due to the maneuver not being flown correctly. Now, sometimes we might have data outages, we might have unexpected weather, we might have unexpected aircraft in the area. So some of those things would necessitate a redo. But monitoring in real time is it's very similar to my first job where I would monitor data in real time in the Mission Control Center. So it was very similar to that, a little bit more fast paced.
It's like a big team essentially then of different kinds of folks bringing together that final go ahead. So
yes.
So my question is, I imagine 2 scenarios. One, you have a brand new vehicle that doesn't really have customers that you're trying to validate or get it ready to go to the first customer. Or you bring in an existing, let's say, production vehicle and you modify it or put in a new engine or something like that. Does your work lie in one area or another of those 2 scenarios?
Both. We do it all. It doesn't matter if it's brand new, like some of our, prototype development aircraft, or if it is, the one of the many iterations of the Black Hawk. That machine has been around for decades.
I love that. I love riding in the Blackhawks. You know what that meant? We didn't have to walk wherever we were going. So that was fun about the Blackhawks. Plus, you got to sit sideways.
And you're safe.
So this is a little bit of a tangent, but it is a helicopter question. How fond are you of the Airwolf TV series?
Now, Airwolf. So I will admit, growing up, when Airwolf was on, I was not really allowed to watch much TV. So if you ask me about, pop cultural references or any references in the time period where I grew up, and I won't necessarily say what decade that was, there's a bit of a blank spot. So, yeah.
So
I would have been familiar and entertained had I been allowed to watch.
So Airwolf was terrible, but it was a supersonic helicopter. It was fun.
Well, I want to actually talk about when you were growing up. And so you had this interest early on. Did you see a lot of other women as role models who were doing the kinds of things that you wanted to do or that you saw yourself doing?
So I did not, but I will say I did not. I was not in an area where I could really look around and see a lot of different careers, people doing the different careers. So I didn't have role models. I also didn't have a general awareness that I'm a woman, I'm not supposed to be an engineer. So I wanted to do, so it's what I did. When I arrived at school and looked around, it became obvious that it was not necessarily a female dominant industry, but it still did not deter me really in any way.
Was your dad a good influence on you? You spoke of him having conversations with you about your career. Was he did he help guide you in a way that turned out to be exactly where you needed to be?
My dad was a good guide. Both of my parents were supportive parents, but not like I was never really told what I should do. I was asked what I wanted to do and how I wanted to, you know, go about achieving those goals. So it wasn't, I wouldn't call it hands off, but it was very much, kind of guiding through questioning and then just general support. I never felt
Freedom, yeah,
unsupported.
the freedom to kind of.
Are
to
are
do all
your
that.
kids are your kids old enough now that when you speak to them, you hear your parents maybe and some of what you say to your own
A
kids?
little bit.
Yeah,
Little
I
bit.
think that happens.
Yes.
I know you catch yourself one day and you go, holy crap, I sound like my dad.
So,
I don't
yeah.
know if that's good or bad.
Yes,
No, I
yes.
think it's good. Well, obviously the reason I bring that up is that's one of the areas that I'm interested in. And I mean, I was one of those kids who probably was not easily, I wouldn't say that it was automatically my lane. I loved science. Math was much more difficult for me, but I think that I didn't have anyone kind of saying these are possible jobs for you. Like, nobody was saying you couldn't do them, but I didn't really even know what half these engineering jobs were. I assumed aerospace engineering meant astronaut, right? Like I had no idea
Mhm.
that all these other jobs existed in there. And I think that that's true for a lot of underrepresented populations. And it's not just
Agree.
women, but I think particularly like poor family, poor children who come from areas like I also grew up with not a lot. So I didn't have the same exposure, I think, to some of the class offerings because I was in a very rural school. So we didn't really have a lot of options. So I think about students like that. And as when I first met you, we talked about the girls in STEM kind of thing. Tell me a little bit about what you did with that in the past and maybe why that's so necessary for our listeners.
So one of my mottos is that I may be the first, but I will make sure that I'm not the only for long. So, if at all possible, in any area, if I can bring along others and teach others that they can, do this career, whatever it is, I will do that. So, one of the great parts about working at a corporation like Lockheed Martin is that there are many initiatives to get kids interested in the STEM fields. And there is a focus on getting underrepresented populations interested in the STEM fields. So a big part of the work I've done in the past with some of our employee resource groups at the various companies I've been at is to keep girls interested in STEM because often they are interested early on in their school careers. And so it's not a matter of exposing them to STEM, it's keeping them interested and allowing them to see that they have a path. It doesn't have to be a prescribed path.
Right.
One of my favorite parts about some of the events we've done with the girls is each of the engineers would tell their story. And it's all a different path. They wind up in similar places, but they do it in a very different way. So I think that helps kids hearing that there are many ways to go about their career. I think it's important because anytime you have folks with diverse backgrounds in a space that's supposed to be innovative, you'll do a lot better. You have to have all of the ideas, and many times ideas are generated from your experiences as a human. So if you have different experiences based on who you are or your background or where you're from, that's all helpful for innovation.
No, I think too. And I think it's that same thing about going back to exposure too. So it's helpful for everybody on that team ultimately to have those diverse perspectives from those backgrounds. And you mentioned story more than once now. You're right. It's the stories that people can relate to, but that also ultimately help us to relate that innovation to any changes that we might have to make or adapt as well. What can we do more to help some of those underrepresented populations be aware of what's out there?
So I think uh, y'all probably know a little better than me. And I say y'all due to my almost decade in Texas. Um, it's exposure at an early age, and then doing events with companies to allow kids to come in and see what the job looked like, see the best parts of the job, and parents supporting their children if they show an interest in something, gathering materials. There's all kinds of stuff that you can get online that doesn't really cost much to keep the kids interested. If they show that spark, keep the spark alive. And I think that parents, teachers, and then also the professional arena has a responsibility to do that, to keep that spark alive all the way out through a kid's education.
I think that's an important point, that oftentimes some of the organizations, I think even the ones that we try to work with, at first assume that you have to wait until they're like juniors or seniors in high school because it's right before college, but they're missing such a huge opportunity to really reach out to kids when they're actually so motivated still in learning. As they get older, sometimes other interests, things like that, but they're so interested in middle school and they really are open to that. It's been a difficult thing, Kevin, right? For you, you call it ageism, reverse ageism or something like that. They kind of don't let you.
Yes, we can't, we struggle because we have super excited 11, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, and you're just not going to get them into an industrial facility or a lab because of the legal liabilities. That's the really hard.
Well, I think when she did it with Sikorsky, that was one of the first ones that we actually brought.
No, I'm talking about internships.
No, I mean, just in general too, like even opening up and doing, like they're doing some kind of organized day for kids.
Right. And I want to piggyback on something you said about for people to stay in STEM, young people, they need opportunities to compete or to learn progressively, and aside from mentors or role models, they need something authentic, right? There's no amount of coloring sheets that I could give a student to color a helicopter that would replace walking into a hangar and putting their hand on one, or sitting in a seat, or talking to you about your recent flight test. That is real and authentic. And that, I feel like, is where education misses the mark a lot of times.
For sure. Not only the educators, though, I think she's right about the organizations too. I wish we could do more to engage those organizations to do more about these, like even if it's a one-day event, something like that.
Sure. I want to pivot just a little topically, if I could, only for sake of time. So now, helicopters aren't just for Earth, right? We've seen this Ingenuity, which is a fantastic tiny little vehicle that's was only supposed to maybe fly once, and now they've done 50 plus flights. What do you see? Well, first of all, do you think Sikorsky will get into the space, a UAV, a rotary UAV on another planet? Do you think that's in the works? Secondly, anything you would like to share about the utility of helicopters on Earth or off of Earth? And maybe where do you see helicopters going in the near future?
So 3-part question. So I think that I honestly am not sure if Sikorsky will get into the helicopter business on other planets, though I would not rule it out. It's a natural progression for the industry. A lot of the industry is going toward the unpiloted vehicles, and that's a natural step toward other areas. So I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. Now, I do know that you had Dr. Bernhard on your podcast before, and he's given you the famous Igor Sikorsky quote about what helicopters are good for with search and rescue. So honestly, yes, helicopters are not going to ever be the fastest vehicle, despite what Airwolf may have, portrayed. They're not necessarily going to be the most comfortable vehicle, though we do try when it's, especially a VIP customer, to make it comfortable, but they can get in and out of places that an airplane cannot get in and out of. They're very durable. And we talked about the Black Hawk earlier. That machine's incredible, and it saved many, many lives over its, decades of service. So the utility of a helicopter is to get into places that are fairly hostile, whether it's, up on the top of a mountain or in people on top of their house with a flood, or if it's, in a war zone. It's a very useful machine for that. And I think the future of helicopters is going to be with more speed, more maneuverability, but its core mission is always going to be search and rescue. That is what it is. What is unique
Right.
about that?
I mean,
machine.
I think about the Coast Guard, right? The Coast Guard's reliance on helicopters. You really don't see boats pulling people out of the water. Always think of the Coast Guard helicopters that pull people out of the water. I also think on the battlefield, eventually it'll be probably an uncrewed helicopter, and something like those Boston Dynamics, the super anthropomorphized, robots. I see a battlefield where we can extract people without endangering other lives. So that. I know war is bad, but if we can kill less people, fewer people. If less people died, how about fewer people died? We're gonna
And
edit.
that's my role. That's the English
we're
side.
gonna
You can
edit that
count
out.
it, it's fewer.
Yes, we're gonna edit that out. Yes, fewer.
Yeah, leave it.
But I do appreciate that you're bringing us back to the core mission, which is search and rescue on Earth, and going places we couldn't otherwise go anywhere else that we might use one. So.
Well, before we do go, I always like to wrap up with some, the advice is always very similar, I find, with people, but at the same time, it's so important, I think, to remind our listeners that there are opportunities out there. So for our listeners who might be thinking about something in this career field, or might be studying cards somewhere related, going, I'm odd, what advice do you have for them?
So I have, I think, two main pieces of advice for, folks who are interested or maybe don't quite know what the path is yet. And that's to, have a general idea of the goal, foster your interest, and then work toward that goal, but don't be deterred by the setbacks, and don't even necessarily think of them as setbacks. So we didn't talk about it, but it took me 10 years to get hired at Sikorsky as a flight test engineer, which was my dream job. I worked in very cool areas along the way. And had I just kind of discarded those and been discouraged that I was not being hired, I would have missed out on some pretty core learning experiences in life. So yes, have a goal, set your sights on that, but take in all of the experiences along the way when you're working toward your goal. And then my main piece of advice for every human, I think, is to know yourself, to understand what drives you, to figure out what your values are, how you measure all of your decisions, bounce them against what your core values and purpose in the world is. That's a hefty thing to do, and it takes a long time, but you will benefit greatly if you really understand what drives you as a person.
It's a great way to end. Rachel, thanks so much for spending your time with us today. And we look forward, I hope to seeing you again with some students.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.